electronic conference, which is organized by the Jean Monnet Foundation for Europe, the Swiss Foreign Policy Association, and CEDIDAC. We are online on YouTube and Facebook. I'm Pat Cox. I'm president of the Jean Monnet Foundation, former president of the European Parliament, and subsequently president of the European Movement International. I'm Irish, I'm online, and I join you from Dublin. In the current pandemic, of course, the work of our foundation continues, but much of it, if not all of it now, virtually on the internet. We're here today for the conference of Radek Sikorski, an eminent European and Polish political figure who will be presented in detail in a few moments. Let me say, Radek Sikorski, on behalf of the foundation, how grateful we are to you for accepting our invitation. I also wish to thank in particular Ambassador Jaroslav Starzik, a member of our council, for initiating this contact with you. Let me briefly, if I can, introduce our foundation to those of you who don't know us. The Jean Monnet Foundation is an independent, non-partisan, and politically non-militant scientific institution. We operate from the heart of the campus of the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. Our foundation was created in 1978 by Jean Monnet himself, the designer of the first European community and the first honorary citizen of Europe, who entrusted it with all of his personal archives. Today, our institution also preserves and offers access to many other private archive collections. We offer researchers a coherent set of unique documentary resources on the origins and developments of European integration, and of course, on Swiss-European relations. The foundation also contributes to the training of students, and at an editorial level, we have a publishing mission, an integral part of our activities, with 2 collections of publications. We regularly organize conferences, debates, and symposia, as well as welcoming visitors on campus. We are a kind of a European crossroads and a key venue for meeting and reflection on major current European issues. I'm happy to present our 2 partners for this event, the Swiss Foreign Policy Association, represented by its president, Kristen Mcwelder. Kristen is a member of the Swiss Federal Parliament, which she presided in 2016. She's vice president of the Legal Affairs Committee and belongs to the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Council. CEDIDAC is one of the centers of the Faculty of Law, Criminal Sciences, and Public Administration of the University of Lausanne, and it is represented by its director, Professor Damiano Canapa, who shall conclude our proceedings today. Our running order will be as follows. There will be an introduction by Kristen Mcwelder of Radek Sikorski, a presentation by our guest of his paper on multilateralism, followed by a question and answer session. As you follow us on YouTube or Facebook, please use the chat lines to make comments or questions, and these will be relayed to both Krista and myself for the subsequent question and answer session. Our theme this evening is multilateralism. I think our guest is especially well placed to reflect on it, and indeed there's much to reflect on together. Rising nationalism, growing power tensions between states, and the United States in a degree of retreat from its post-war global leadership role, all together bring pressure and strain on our inherited multilateral order today. We moved after the Second World War from a period dominated by bipolarity between the US and the Soviet Union to unipolarity after the collapse of the Soviet Union to renewed tensions and great power rivalry today. After the annexation of Crimea by Russia, the G7 shrank to the G8 shrank to the G7. Or was it in reality a journey to becoming the G2, the USA and China? Or is that even transitioning because of tensions from G2 to G0, where none of them want to stand up and lead? And of course, we're here, for us here in Europe, where does the EU stand? Where does Switzerland stand? Where do we fit into this frame? What, if anything, can we do? What should we do? What must we do to reinvigorate multilateralism and to promote, protect, and defend our interests? Because the multilateral way has been a key pillar of how we've grown together. I would like now to invite Kristen Mcwelder, Member of Parliament and President of the Swiss Foreign Policy Association, please to introduce herself and our guest.
Thank you so much, Pat Cox, for this nice introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, also from my side, welcome to our today's conference on multilateralism. I'm very happy about your interest on this crucial topic. Today's globalized world has generated a variety of globalized problems, from climate change to financial crisis to cybersecurity, and also to our current pandemic situation that can be effectively addressed only through multilateral agreements and cooperation. Multilateralism is fundamental to the liberal world order created after the Second World War. It has been crucial in maintaining peace and prosperity. It has also been central to the past successes of the various multilateral organizations in addressing the global financial crisis and promoting international financial stability. Nevertheless, the system is now challenged with its core goals and values by different players. The political dissatisfaction with multilateralism in major advanced industrialized countries, such as the United States, is associated with the failure of global governance in the post-Bretton Woods system to stem the tide of slow growth, rising inequality, falling labor force participation, rising migration, social fragmentation, and job insecurity associated with globalization and automation. For the past about 3 decades, it has been widely recognized that the current multilateral system needs to be reformed due to rapid changes in the economic, demographic, and political weight of advanced and emerging economies. But political rigidities in multilateral organizations or the simple political unwillingness of leaders have prevented adequate reform within crucial multilateral organizations such as the UN, IMF, World Bank, WTO, and others. The resulting disillusionment with formal multilateralism has led to the consideration of various alternatives, such as the parallel pursuit of bilateral deals or cooperation that is limited to like-minded or geographically proximate countries. None of these alternatives have plausible chances of replacing multilateralism. However, since a globalized world facing globalized challenges requires an open, rule-based international order to ensure that the system works in the service of all nations and people. What is needed is to find the right balance between true multilateralism, defined as a universal rules of the game, and the large number of plurilateral agreements that permit greater flexibility to move on agenda forward when universal consensus cannot or need not be achieved. I'm very pleased to introduce now our speaker, Radoslav Sikorski, today. Mr. Sikorski is a Polish politician and currently member of the European Parliament. In the EP, he's the chair of the delegation for relation with the United States, as I am in the Swiss Parliament, a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, as I am also in the Swiss Parliament, and a member of a subcommittee on security and defense. Mr. Sikorski previously held different high posts in the Polish government for his party, the Civic Platform. He served as a Minister of National Defense from 2005 to 2007 and as a Minister for Foreign Affairs from 2007 to 2014. After that, he was Speaker of the Sejm of the Polish Republic. As the Sejm is the lower house of the Polish two-chamber parliament, Mr. Sikorski and I just missed each other holding very similar offices at the same time, as I was the president of the Swiss National Council and the Federal Assembly in 2016. Mr. Sikorski is a graduate of the University of Oxford. In his earlier career, he worked as a journalist for various outlets and was a correspondent in Afghanistan and Angola. Among his many other commitments and functions, he is notably a senior fellow at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University and a distinguished statesman at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Mr. Sikorski, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
I'm very grateful and honored to be invited to the Jean Monnet Foundation. Jean Monnet, of course, is a giant of European politics. And apart from anything else, I wouldn't be a member of the European Parliament if it wasn't for the foundations of European integration that Jean Monnet laid in those horrible years in the 1940s and 50s. And of course, a Swiss foundation is the right place to talk about multilateralism, because we know what happened when the previous effort at multilateralism, the League of Nations, failed. What followed was much worse than the admittedly many faults of the League of Nations. We've seen that movie and we know how it ends. I'd like to start by just asking you to take a look at the events in the last few days and even last few hours. And they all have a multilateral aspect. There is an actual war in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an Armenian enclave in Azerbaijan. The conflict dates back to the Soviet Union, when Nagorno-Karabakh was not a full republic of the Soviet Union, but only an autonomous republic with all the consequences. You see, constitutional arrangements, even when the constitution seems fake, like the Soviet Union constitution was, do have their consequences, because we now have a shooting war. Right now, people are dying. And it's also, of course, a failure of the OSCE system, of which both Armenia and Azerbaijan are members, and there is an OSCE monitoring mission there. We've had the debate, first and possibly last one, in the United States between President Donald Trump and his Democratic challenger. And what was characteristic was that foreign affairs were not mentioned. Even though China is a part of the campaign. And the reason for that is that I think many in the US imagine, and not only in Mr. Trump's party, that the United States is so big and powerful that it can take itself out of the international context and be, in a certain sense, above the international system. This month, it will also see the crunch point on Brexit. We have a high-level British delegation in Brussels, and we will learn in the next couple of weeks whether a deal can be had or not. And of course, Pat knows better than I that it's an issue of British constitutionalism, of British colonial history, but it's also an issue of multilateralism, because the Brexit fantasy is that you can become legally autarkic, that by leaving the European Union, somehow international rules will no longer apply to Britain, that Britain will become self-referential and become the judge of its own treaties, and that you can have a world in which Britain always controls the bodies which affect her fate. And we'll see about that. I personally think that Britain is swapping one bundle of treaties for another bundle of treaties. But no partner of Britain will submit itself to British judgment in case of disputes, whether it's WTO or the International Criminal Court, because to do so would mean to the establishment of British hegemony rather than multilateralism. And we are not revisiting that. We have a change of government in my country, in Poland. The new cabinet has just been announced, and that has a very strong multilateral component, because Poland is one of the countries that the European Commission has just criticized on the grounds of rule of law. The Commission has just published its report. It, of course, covers all countries. It's a sort of peer review, and members were able to comment and correct facts in the report. It's, of course, adopted by the entire college, which means that all the members who have their commissioners in the college cannot now claim that it's some kind of diktat. And Poland's relationship with the EU is rocky, because we have a nationalist government which is breaking EU treaties. And it's another fantasy that somehow you can be a member of the European Union, and be a beneficiary of not just EU funds, but also Swiss funds, also Norway funds, but not be bound by treaties that one has voluntarily entered into. In other words, only take from the multilateral system what you benefit from without any strings attached, without any reciprocal obligations. And this fantasy is also going to be tested now. And lastly, we've just had a State of the Union address by the relatively new President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who has posed the project of a geopolitical EU, an EU that would become a player in international affairs. And I'll come back to that. Because I'd like to tell you that my vision for the EU, my version of multilateralism for the European Union, in which I'm a legislator, is that it should be a kind of Switzerland with nukes. With nukes, but without the neutrality. And I think that we should study the Swiss experience of multilateralism, of federalism, of confederalism very closely, because I think the Swiss experience is actually a better guide to the EU's constitutional development than the United States. First of all, because we are multilingual, and secondly, because we have been for far longer, and still are, in the stage of confederation, longer than the United States. I think that the European Union is a confederation, in fact, the only existing one, because ultimate sovereignty, as Brexit shows, ultimately lies with the member states. The United States was also a confederation, but between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. And it fought the War of Independence as a confederation. And it didn't work. And it almost failed. Because in a confederation, the obeying of the rules ultimately depends on the goodwill and a sense of propriety of members who cannot be forced to obey the rules. So what George Washington found was that laws were passed to supply him with men, with resources, with ammunition, and then wouldn't show up on the battlefield. And that's why he later insisted on a unity of command and on there being a commander-in-chief in the constitutional federal state. It is said that the point of no return in creating the American Federation was first achieved when Alexander Hamilton made the deal with Virginia over the payment of in the War of Independence debts. Richer states took responsibility for the obligations of some of the poorer states, and in return, the capital was moved from New York to Virginia, to what was then Virginia. Arguably, the Union became irresolvable, permanent, only with the Civil War. And I understand that you had a fairly bloodless, liberal civil war in Switzerland in mid-19th century as well, and that decided the issue. That whereas you are still called a confederation, in fact, you are a federal state. And as I see the problem with the European Union is that it is opposite to what the Eurosceptics, particularly British ones, would have you. Namely, not that there is too much power of enforcement at the center in Brussels, but, as you might expect from what I've said before, too little. When you look at the three crises that I see in the European Union, 3.5, the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, the health crisis, and the foreign affairs ineffectiveness crisis, that's the half. They all have their origin in one thing. It's not exactly a failure of multilateralism, it's actually a failure to honor voluntarily agreed treaties. Why did the Eurozone crisis happen? Because some member states were breaching the conditions of the Growth and Stability Pact and were running deficits that were much higher than they were allowed. Why did we have the migration crisis? Because some member states, some of the same ones, were allowing undocumented foreigners to cross Europe's external perimeter in breach of the Schengen Treaty. Why did we have outrage in Italy at companies from some other member states for stopping masks and respirators from getting to Italy at when they desperately needed it at the height of the first wave of pandemic? Because some member states and companies from the member states were breaking the rules of the single market. And why is Europe ineffectual on the international scene? Literally, it is not in the lead at the moment on any single international issue. If you read the Lisbon Treaty, I think it's Articles 25 and 26, they are very strong. That we are pledging ourselves not to multilateralism, much more to agreeing joint foreign policy in the Foreign Affairs Council, and then to loyal implementation of the agreed policy, and to do nothing that would undermine the joint policy. And of course, that's not what's happening. Whether on Ukraine with the Normandy process, or on Russia, or on China, or on Iran, or on Syria, or on Libya, or on the United States. We agreed one policy in the Council, and then the bigger member states run their own national policies in Parliament in parallel, very often at a tangent to what has been agreed. And of course, each breaching of the treaties eventually leads to a crisis. I just hope that we'll find the wisdom of Jean Monnet and others before us to return to a constitutional process, such as the one that failed in Holland and France, and somehow find a way to make our treaties stick, because the alternative in a world in which rules are not being obeyed is too horrible to contemplate. Now, I've been sent some questions by you, so let me end by trying to answer, not all of them, but just a few. You've asked me, is there a correlation between the surge in nationalism worldwide and the weakening of multilateralism? And my answer is, obviously there is. Nationalists are people whose sense of loyalty, identification, even imagination doesn't extend beyond their own national group. That is the only level, or the highest level, at which they feel solidarity with other people. So obviously, the more nationalistic the members of the international community, the harder it is for them to collaborate, because interests are obviously not identical and very often not aligned. So yes, nationalism is weakening multilateralism, including the UN system. To what extent does Brexit weaken Europe on the world scale? I'm not sure it does. I mean, we are very sorry to see the departure of Britain, whose diplomats have a global perspective, which still has an army that is serious. And is technologically an advanced state, and of course a net contributor to the European Union. But Britain could not imagine creating a joint defense policy and conducting its foreign policy in common with the others. The traditional of living under rules that only Britain controls is just too strong. I've made a rule for myself that empires, because it's not just Britain, it goes for Turkey, for Russia, that have not been defeated in war or have not suffered the way we all suffered on the continent, cannot make those compromises that are required to live under agreed rules. And therefore, Britain was often a spoiler in creating a more united foreign and defense policy. And I just hope we find another platform to collaborate with Britain, but that will create something more unified that would have been impossible with the British on the inside. Could the European Union become one day a strong global actor? Well, we are a strong global actor on some issues. So, for example, on finance, we're about to become more important than in the past, I believe. This huge recovery fund will create a pool of hundreds of billions of new desirable bonds that will be held in the reserve funds of states and national banks. And with the weakness of the dollar, I think this is an opportunity for the euro to become a much more important currency. We are a regulatory superpower in many fields, but there is one field where we might be the only regulatory authority that has a chance to establish civilized rules, and that is cyber. China plays by its own rules, and we don't want those, with mass surveillance and misusing of data. The United States has rules that suit private companies, and since Congress is pretty much captured by private interests, I don't expect the US Congress to be in a position to regulate Facebook's or Twitter's algorithm to serve the public good rather than the financial interests of its shareholders. And therefore Europe, because we don't have those companies, but we are a regulatory superpower, is the only place where we can do it in a way that balances the interests of companies and citizens. And one of the reasons I joined the Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the EU is that I hope to take part in that work. But to become a superpower, which, as I declared, I'd like Europe to be, we need the full spectrum of a traditional power, including military. You know, it's unfair of us to expect that the Americans will rescue us if Libya blows up again, or if the regime in Algeria implodes. This is our southern neighborhood. We should be able to do it on our own, and we will not be a global power until and unless we can stabilize at least our own immediate neighborhood. And for that, we need less talk and more military capability. The Commission proposal of 13 billion euros in the new budget, unfortunately there are now some plans to cut it, would be a good beginning. What's been the impact of the Trump administration on multilateralism? Well, complete disaster. I mean, by denouncing the UN, by starving the UN system of resources, the Trump administration has simply left the field open for others to fill the vacuum. And China, what diplomats in New York tell me is that Russia, China are now much more influential in the UN system than they ever were in the past, which I think is a defeat for Trump's publicly stated goals. And lastly, what type of multilateralism is China trying to promote? Well, I think China is opportunistically getting into those places that are vacated by the United States, but also China is trying to recreate a traditional Chinese system, which is to be the central power surrounded by vassal states. And by vassal states, I don't mean conquered states, I don't mean colonies, I mean just countries that recognize China's cultural, technical, and military primacy. That, according to the Chinese, I'm told, is a natural state of affairs that they are trying to rebuild. But of course, the trouble is that some of those potential vassal states are strong allies of the United States in China's immediate neighborhood, and that is, in fact, the biggest long-term threat to international peace, I believe. If you ask me today, you know, I mean, one of the things that I worry about is, you know, China, I think, is serious about wanting to reunite with Taiwan by force if need be. And I don't think the United States can concede that, because it would then lose credibility in the face of its other Far Eastern allies, such as Korea, Japan, and others. And that's a potential flashpoint that, of course, would create the complete collapse of multilateralism on a global scale. And on that happy note, let me end. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a really stimulating presentation and a very wide-ranging set of remarks. I want to pick up something which you've had as a thread through your contribution, and that is the need for what I might call more collective European sovereignty and influence over its foreign policy and defence. You gave a wonderful journalistic and political gift in the phrase, you'd like the EU to be Switzerland with nukes, but without the neutrality. And just in coming back to visit that thought, I'm reminded of a lecture that I delivered nearly 2 decades ago in the College of Europe in Natolin in Warsaw. And the rector at the time was the wonderful Bronislaw Geremek. And I was going through many of the evident weaknesses of Europe's capacity to act. I'm thinking even of comparatively straightforward things like a heavy lift capacity in terms of airline. And I am shocked 2 decades later how little has actually changed. The ambitious words are there. The treaties have been amended and they express the kinds of ambitions to which you refer. So what is holding it back? And do you really believe there is a possibility to take a step towards some kind of more shared sovereignty? What would it be? What is Switzerland with nukes but without neutrality for you?
Well, the question is whether we can get there by the Jean Monnet method, which was to achieve small improvements and small steps by technical means without grandiose projects, get people to work together, and then achieve a new level of integration. And this method has worked brilliantly in many areas, but I believe is very, very difficult to apply in the areas of foreign affairs and defense, because these are the core areas of sovereignty. But if I were to apply the Jean Monnet method to the military field, I would make the following, and I am making the following argument. Look, we've had battle groups for 20 years, actually a British idea. So a battalion from 3 member states is on standby for now a year. So together a brigade, and potentially it could be used in North Africa or somewhere like that. However, it has not been used for 20 years. Why? Because the 3 countries would have to agree simultaneously, and they would have to pay for it. And I think if you construct it like that, it'll never happen. So in the spirit of Jean Monnet, I have just proposed amendments to the various reports, my own report on permanent structured cooperation in the area of defense, to transform the battle group concept, that we should have a brigade-size unit, but composed not of subunits from member states, but from volunteers from member states. Because in every EU country, even those that are unserious about defense, there are young people who actually like to serve in a proper army. I'd like that brigade to be trained by the French Foreign Legion. I'd like it to be called the European Legion. I'd like it to be funded from the common EU budget, and we already have an envelope for it. It's called the Peace Fund, and as its name suggests, suggests it is designed to finance military operations, and it should be answerable to the Foreign Affairs Council voting by a majority vote. And if it's volunteers, if it's paid for from the joint budget, then I can imagine A, for the Council to actually deploy it, and B, for the people of Europe to find it politically acceptable to use it. So that's the way, you know, I would try, I'm trying to push this forward.
Well, I can see certainly in picking on one thing like that and giving the example that you gave, there is that Monnet logic of doing something concrete and pragmatic rather than something that is woolly and wholly conceptual. Sticking with this theme, if I may, you touch on your desire to see majority voting. Its counterpart, of course, is the point you finished on of the enormous sovereignty sensitivity of foreign policy, security and defense. Would majority voting, should it happen, and it's a desire expressed, I think, in the State of the Union address, would that require a change of treaty or just a change of mind?
Well, you need to answer those sages from the legal department, legal services. There are various interpretations, but I'm trying to educate our Polish nationalists on this particular issue right now, because the subject before the Council in Brussels at the moment is whether or not to extend the sanctions on Russia for the annexation of Crimea, whether to impose Magnitsky-type sanctions on Belarus for the recent crackdown, and simultaneously what to do about the dispute between Turkey and Cyprus. And of course, Cyprus is linking the issues and blocking decisions. So I'm trying to make Polish nationalists realize, look, you may think that the veto is a wonderful thing to wield because you think you will be the only ones who will be wielding it. But look, on something that you care about, sanctions on Vladimir Putin, somebody else is wielding the veto, and it is not in your interest. So I hope there is this reflection.
Let me ask you, and then I might ask Krista to come in with some questions and comments. Could I ask you about something where I think you're kind of uniquely well placed to give a view, and it's in this pragmatic foreign affairs action zone. We talk about joint actions, and this aspiration has been in the European treaties and has been on the Foreign Affairs Council, of which you've been an eminent member, and we have our high representative. And if I think, for example, to make it concrete, in particular of the Eastern Partnership, and you were involved intimately with the definition and foundation of the Eastern Partnership, this is a joint policy, jointly agreed, animated by various European Union actions. Part of that action led to the embrace of the Eastern Partnerships, Ukraine included. You found yourself in the extraordinary position of being in the same room, I believe, with President Yanukovych on the night before he fled Ukraine and when his form of rule was collapsing around him. You were there, the foreign ministers, I think, of France and Germany were there, and you had Vladimir Lukin representing the Kremlin, as I understand. And then along came Normandy, and you were out, even though Poland as a neighbor has a huge interest. And I might say, not to diminish Poland's possibilities, the EU was out. We had a high representative. We had a joint action, which was an Eastern Partnership. was our Eastern Partnership, which among other things fomented these changes. And then the door was locked. And what absolutely staggered me was no one on the EU side or in the name of the EU went to these early conferences post-Normandy in Berlin to kick the door in and say, I should be at this table. Or if locked out, to be accompanied by the media to say, I'm not putting up with this stuff. Why doesn't stuff like that happen?
Not only should the high rep of the EU be at this table, the ministers of foreign affairs of Germany and France should not be at that table. Because this was it. When I asked Steinmeier and Fabius to join me in Kiev with the mission to stop the bloodshed on the Maidan, I asked for permission and the blessing of Lady Ashton for it to be an EU mission, because this was a European crisis. Those Ukrainians were demonstrating because Yanukovych lied to them that he would sign the association agreement with the EU and then didn't sign it. So, and I think it was, first of all, a diplomatic mistake by the new President Poroshenko, and also a mistake by Chancellor Merkel, one of the very few ones that I would criticize her for, because she probably felt that she can get more out of Putin, which was an illusion. There was a process already going called the Geneva process, which was the correct framework. It was the EU, United States, Russia, Ukraine. I mean, the Normandy process, which excluded high rep and excluded Poland. You know, Poland is a neighbor of both Russia and Ukraine, has a much bigger stake in this conflict than France. And quite frankly, much deeper knowledge of Ukraine. You know, we were the same country with Ukraine for 400 years. So yes, mistakes are made. And I'm afraid, you know, at the time of Lady Ashton and then Federica to some extent, you know, the EU could at least claim that it was that the Iran deal was mainly driven by the EU, right? And there was some useful mediating between Serbia and Kosovo. But since then, name me one thing on which the EU is in the lead. And there was an extraordinary interview in the FT 2 weeks ago by Mr. Borrell, in which he finally said what we've seen for months, namely that the member states are not allowing him to do the job. Yeah, this is the classic thing in the EU. Member states paralyze the relevant EU institution and then blame the EU for being weak. Classic.
Well, look, I can sense your frustration. I share it. I'm sorry we don't have a chance to chat later privately over dinner to go through some of this. I went to Brussels at that time and met with President Barroso and complained about the absence of Lady Ashton and wanted to know what he was going to do as Commission President. So he explained to me that this was for the High Representative, who was already locked outside that door. Krista, I hand over to you to take this forward for the moment.
Thank you so much, Pat, and thank you also very much, Radek, for your great presentation and for your tour d'horizon about the current challenges, not only on multilateralism, but also very concrete conflict lines and conflicts. And as you mentioned, I was also frustrated that in yesterday's presidential debate in the US Foreign Affairs wasn't at all a topic. And I think the whole debate was quite a disaster, not just that they didn't discuss foreign affairs or the role of the United States in the world, but it also means that they lost maybe a little bit of their moral leadership, that they used to be a role model for democracy, for prosperity, for chances. And right now it doesn't seem, just before the election, that they can stick into this old role model again. Thank you also for your compliments for Switzerland to be a potential role model for the European Union. I think there are a lot of commonalities. We consist of 26 cantons and have also different languages, religions, different topographic situation. We share the same languages with our neighbor states, and we are enormously interconnected with the European internal market. And it's also a huge interest of Switzerland to have a good and close and very also ongoing relations with the European Union. And we right now try to establish the legal basis for our bilateral treaties. And
congratulations on the outcome of the referendum, which gives hope to all of us in Europe that populists can be defeated.
Thank you very much. Yes, we were a large alliance last Sunday, and it was a large majority of over 60% who voted down this radically popular initiative, which wanted to end the free movement of persons with the European Union. And I have to underline that both sides really benefit from the free movement of persons, because a lot of European citizens come and work in Switzerland, as a lot of Swiss also live and work in the European Union, and we have a common interest to have this good and well-working system going on.
But you should join the EU's roaming system, because you're overcharging EU citizens for roaming in Switzerland.
There are parliamentary proposals for that, because obviously you are right. It's not the only high-level price segment that Switzerland knows, but it's also a problem. But let me maybe come back to the last topic that you just discussed, also with Pat Cox, because the Ukraine and its situation is a real concern for myself as well, since I once founded also a parliamentary friendship group between Switzerland and Ukraine, and I several times visited the country and have a lot also of contacts and read regularly their newsletters from the Ukraine Crisis Center, which describes how many people are wounded on the battlegrounds, how many attacks were going on. And I mean, we see a hot war in the eastern part of Europe, right in our neighborhood. And on the other hand, we see also frozen conflicts, such in Georgia or in the Republic of Moldova. Do you think that this hot conflict turns into the same type of frozen conflict, that there is a violation of international law, sanctions are implemented, but at the end of the day, you just live with the situation as it is presenting today? What is your opinion on that?
My advice consistently to Ukraine, to Moldova and others in a similar situation is the following. Don't try to solve it, because it doesn't depend on you. Do those things that you control. And what you control is how you modernize your country. And if you modernize your country, then in 10 or 20 or 30 years, the people living in the unmodernized part of your country will come and join you on their own. Because if you spend 20 years begging President Putin for sympathy, it's going to be a waste of your time. And moreover, Europe will not reject you if the lack of control over your territory is not your fault. You know, there are territorial disputes in other parts of the continent. You know, Spain, Gibraltar, island of Ireland, Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus, and so on. We have admitted countries with territorial disputes if we feel that they are doing their best and it's not their fault. Therefore, implementing European law, those deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, European standards in all areas. That's how you make your country successful, And then already companies in Transnistria, for example, are transforming themselves in the European model because that's the only way that they can trade with the EU. And that, I think, is the right way to go.
Yes, that is really the idea of Jean Monnet, huh? Economic development and prosperity, and with that you also create the basic for a better future and also for a democratic future. And of course, you're part of the country that you can develop like this is much more attractive than the other part of the territory, which is kind of autonomous or occupied. But thank you very much for this.
And you know what? It already works. You mentioned Ukraine. It took Ukraine some years to fulfill very tough criteria that we imposed before allowing Ukraine to have a visa-free regime with the EU. They had to introduce biometric passports. They had to create a database of the passports they issued. They had to sign readmission treaties. They had to reform their border guards. But as a result, the Ukrainian passport is now more valuable than a Russian one. Mm-hmm. And in some border areas, that's a real argument for independence.
Thank you very much. I would also stick to the question of our multilateral law system, because you mentioned other cases where international law or treaties were violated or infringed, even within the European Union. But how do you see how to deal with so-called illiberal democracies? I mean, what happens within the European Union, and I especially would like to mention not your home country, but rather Hungary, when you see the development, the political developments there, and especially, I don't speak about just the democracy, I rather speak about freedom of press, about closing the Eastern University, about, how to deal with citizens that do not believe in the ideology of Fidesz party. How do you think can we as European countries, policymakers, deal with these so-called illiberal democracies?
Illiberal democracies are also inevitably kleptocracies. Just 10 days ago, Europe's anti-corruption body, Olaf, has published its report, and Hungary is something like 400% more corrupt than the EU average, measured by the misuse of EU funds. So Poland is not actually, but Hungary is just in a completely different league. And that's less focused upon, that Fidesz has created a crony capitalism in which it's very difficult to conduct business if you're not connected to the party, but if you are connected to the ruling clique, you make yourself rich. One of the definitions of democracy is that it's a system in which the government can lose an election. My old friend Viktor Orban has created a system in which even if you count votes honestly on the day, and there are some problems with that, the playing field is so tilted in the media sphere, in access to financial resources, that it's very difficult for the opposition ever to win. But they've started winning. I mean, to Fidesz's alarm, was it last year or the year before, the opposition parties got together and agreed joint candidates for in the municipal elections, and they won several victories, including, I think, Budapest. So, when you have this strong a ruling behemoth, you have to stick together. And your first task is to re-establish competitive democracy.
May I ask another general question, because you mentioned the kleptocracies and of course also the corruption. So just in very general words, how can we bring up a system in which corruption can be really fought? Because this is not just a problem, for instance, in a country like Hungary, as you would concretely mention. It's a problem all over the world. It's also a problem in Ukraine or in Russia that we talked before, but it's a problem in Africa. It's a problem in also civilized countries. But what are your ideas? Because I saw some models, for instance, for public civil servants in the Republic of Moldova, that they have to publish their income and their fortune. And of course, this helps when you see that suddenly they have much more fortune or income, but it creates other problems as well, such as, for instance, that you are in danger, that someone tries to put pressure on you because they know how much money you have or whatever. But have you once saw a really working anti-corruption system?
Well, I think Poland is actually relatively uncorrupt, and that's because we introduced those registers of interest early on, and you know, I have to declare all my income and all my property. It's public knowledge, including my tax returns. And in our government, a minister was dismissed and charged criminally for not declaring a watch.
Okay.
And you have to, at the moment we have a ruling party which has subjugated the prosecution service. So now we have a system whereby if an opposition politician makes the smallest infringement, they have the full weight of the law thrown at them. And if you are a politician of the ruling party, the investigation is quashed. And that will lead to corruption, and it already has, I'm sure. But there is also the international aspect of it, multilateral aspect of it, that I hope Switzerland can support, because there are two institutions that enable corruption on a massive scale globally. One is the institution of a tax haven, which was a lawyer's creation in the 1960s. You know, we never legislated for there to be tax havens. And it is estimated that 50 trillion euros is kept in tax havens. Now, if you can think of a legitimate use of tax havens, please tell me, but I think it's mostly used to avoid taxes and to hide ill-gotten gains. And all those bad people you mentioned, Russian, Ukrainian oligarchs, African kleptocrats, they all use those tax havens. And I know that Switzerland is now in compliance, that the Swiss bank account is a legend from the past, that in cases of breach of law, the banking secrecy is not as secret as it used to be. But there are other jurisdictions which are the way Switzerland was 50 years ago. And I think we should tackle that. And the other institution that is routinely misused is the institution of an anonymous corporation. Why do you need to hold, to own a house in London through an anonymous corporation in the Virgin Islands rather than personally? I mean, explain to me the legitimate use of such a scheme. We could pass laws that make it illegal. We could say a Polish citizen or a Swiss citizen will be punished. It is a crime to hold accounts in an anonymous corporation in the following jurisdictions: those that do not observe the OECD standards on financial transparency. We could do this. You know, if people created these vehicles, people can also unmake them. We would, and think of what we could do with 50 trillion euros. We could rescue our health services. We could invest in our infrastructure. We could invest in greater equality. We could invest in defense capabilities instead of the rich getting even richer by not paying taxes.
Thank you for mentioning that Switzerland is not a tax haven anymore, as you see it in other areas of the world. And I have also to underline that we passed a lot of bilateral automatic exchange agreement in order to not to be the place for tax avoiding or tax fraud from all over the world. But still, I would ask you another question. I mean, your approach is rather to deal with like bans or to say, okay, I don't know, for instance, a trust is illegal in the future while it is today in certain jurisdiction allowed. But let us talk about also education and culture. I think there are societies where corruption was for so many years deep within the administration, in politics, in the society. It was like accepted. And how can we find other approaches in order that people realize corruption is something unfair, is something that also damages the state, the society, the institutions, the trust into the institution. I think we should also think of all those areas, not just the legal instruments, which are of course also of interest and important, but like try to bring culture change.
Yeah, but we probably wouldn't agree on the list of countries that need to be re-educated. I mean, look at the United States. 2 or 3 dozen of the closest collaborators of the President of the United States are already in jail, some of them for corruption and money laundering, which shows, and his own tax returns are also very interesting, aren't they? Which which shows how weak the system is, even in a country as sophisticated a country as the United States.
May I come back?
Sorry. I give it back to you. Sorry, I don't want to dominate the debate.
Again, there's something on my mind that goes back to your introductory remarks. And this was about the idea that you presented that if Europe was looking for spaces to be a regulatory leader and have real influence, that the cyberspace was one. So if we're looking at 2 levels, the citizen and the system, for the citizen, we have the surveillance state of China. We have the partitioning or the attempted partitioning of, indeed by Russia also, of the open and global nature of the internet by the Great Firewall of China, for example, and some of the movements now under the Kremlin in Russia. In the United States, we have regulatory capture. Effectively, votes are bought in Congress, and we have the cyber subject at the individual level, at best is a consumer, and in practice is probably just a commodity to be traded. And so it seems to me if Europe, to do with our traditions, to do with the sense of human rights and human dignity, to do with our treaties, want to build something here, we have to build it around the cyber subject as citizen with an embodied set of rights and not just consumer commodity. And the second element of the question is the systemic part. We can all see, and we can pick numerous examples whether the US elections, the Brexit vote, interference in Ukraine, the extraordinary amount of disinformation, which is evident all around us today, again, leading on that in an open, transparent and rules-based way would be a powerful contribution to guarding the value of the public square, which is being diminished constantly through rabbit holes and echo chambers and micro-targeting. And the more we disappear into it, the more we diminish the democratic character and the nature of our democratic debates. I know there's a lot in that to unpack, but since you've mentioned it as a target, could you develop, please, a bit your thinking of how and when that might happen?
Well, I think we're so far behind the curve. You know, the World Wide Web was launched in 1989, okay? So usually it takes 25 years for an invention to be regularized. It took 25 years between the invention of the car and the highway code. So it's high time, you know, and we now see that the internet is wonderful, but it has some downsides. And, you know, television is regulated, newspapers are regulated, radio is regulated. Why shouldn't this thing be regulated? You know, there are some algorithms which are pernicious. There are algorithms on which Mr. Zuckerberg makes a lot of money that encourage us into extremism. We have a right to have influence over how they write their algorithms. Just like we in the past had the right to ban a newspaper that would be, racist or incendiary. Just because they do it in the cyberspace shouldn't give them immunity from the law. You know, the technical means by which you do the various things is a secondary issue. Rights of citizens is one thing. We have rights to privacy, to fair representation, but even on very straightforward grounds of fairness of competition. You know, if you have these digital shops that, you know, compete, but they also compete with shops in the high street, which have to pay rents, and who pay taxes on those rents. You know, the playing field is not level. And we need to have we need to educate our prosecution, our police authorities, our judges about these techniques, because we're way behind. And we need to develop a body of law to regulate something that should be, whose downsides should be minimized, just like we did before.
Again, forgive me for jumping around, but you presented such a wide menu of options. Let me try a taste of one other one. You talked about the US and China and the various pressures. If we look at the evolving possibility of developing EU foreign policy, we can see already the enormous potential to be squeezed economically and otherwise between China and US. I pick 5G and Huawei as an example. There are many examples. Indeed, some closer to the Polish heart, the Nord Stream 2 and so on. But there are lots of examples. We see the weighty, I would suggest, excess of the US willing to screw its own allies as it abandons an Iranian deal that we all negotiated together. Yes. We see the Chinese willingness to use trade openness or not as a sanctions policy. It's stated softly, but it's a very powerful instrument. And that from the outside. And then within the Union, we have so many states with various dependencies on US or China. I'm thinking particularly of the Belt and Road Initiative and the growing quality of clientelism on a bilateral basis between states and China. which is like nibbling at the ability to develop a coherent capacity within. So there's both the external and the internal forces combining. How do you analyze those, and what perspective do you have, given that these are now embedded forces outside and inside?
You know, there is the old saying in the EU that it is composed of small states. It's just that some of them don't yet know it. But vis-a-vis China, I think they all now know it, because it's so in your face, right? And so, and with China now becoming much more assertive, I think too assertive for its own good, it's easier to make the argument that we need strategic autonomy, economic autonomy, and regulatory autonomy. Because as you say, if the Americans try to do to us over China, which is to use the dollar clearing system as a pressure point vis-a-vis China, then we are dead. I mean, we can live without trade with Iran. We cannot live without trade with China, and therefore we have to develop. We need to collaborate with the United States, because most of our interests, you know, opening of the Chinese economy, China not stealing our intellectual property, China not imposing those deals on companies where you eventually lose your shirt, and so on and so on. On all those things, we should collaborate with the United States, but it should be it should be an EU-US effort rather than the US playing off and dominating each EU country one by one. I don't like it when the US does what Russia tries to do. But I think the understanding of it is, the penny is dropping, and in that sense, President Trump has been very helpful.
Perhaps for me, a final question, if I could. Given your role in the European Parliament and your engagement with the transatlantic dialogue for the Parliament with the United States, what is your feeling, your prognosis about the state of the Union in the United States, the upcoming election and its potential aftermath as we see it unfolding with much anxiety, I think, unfolding before our eyes?
It pains me to say it because I'm married to an American. I have 2 American children. But America, which used to be an example for us, is now a damaged democracy. It's no longer a fully fledged democracy. You know, a system in which Biden has to get at least 4 million votes more than Trump to have a chance of winning is not my definition of democracy. A system in which to become a congressman, you have to raise, depending on the district, obviously, but for example, the one I know from New Jersey, $7 million every 2 years. You know, I gained my seat in Poland, I spent 50,000 euros. You know, if a businessman gives me 5,000 euros, that means he likes me. But if he gives me 500,000, that means he owns me. And that's the system they have in the United States. That's not right. That's not democratic. But to change it, you need the control of both branches of government in and both houses of Congress in the hands of one party. There are there is a chance that the Democrats will gain both the presidency and the Senate right now. And I will just pray that they use that power, if they get it, to fix the system and not to go for some of the more ideological pipe dreams that are also present in the Democratic Party. They need to create a European-style healthcare system. They need to reform their campaign finance. They need to fix the electoral college. They need to fix the Senate. I mean, it might have been democratic once that California and Rhode Island have the same representation in the Senate, but it's certainly not democratic today. America has real problems, and those are our problems because we rely on America for security.
Well, look, I think I'm going to close out here, but I think one of our very good Irish journalists and authors, Fintan O'Toole, I paraphrase him, but wrote a very interesting piece talking about the great admiration that we've been raised with towards the United States, but that for the first time in his lifetime, he'd come round to have a sense of pity more than admiration. And I certainly think the state of US democracy at the moment is a sight to behold. Look, I think it's been great having you. We're going to have you back. I want to thank Kristen for her cooperation. I want to thank you for your presence. And I would like to invite our colleague now, Damiano Canapi, please, to close out. Radek, thank you very much. We have to get you back again. You're wonderfully stimulating. And I'm sure Kristen, myself, and our followers on YouTube and elsewhere would be glad to be able to do that again, or ideally have you in Lausanne as our guest.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Damiano, over to you to close out.
Thank you very much, Pat. Thank you, Mr. Sikorski. Thank you, Ms. Mcwelder. Thank you, Pat, for this very interesting talk and following discussion. What I want to do now in the following minutes in this closing note is to analyze the need for reform of multilateralism by assessing one aspect of its evolution over the last couple of years, meaning the evolution of the position, the relative positions of the US and of China, and also by focusing on one problem that is currently raised by the COVID-19 pandemic. A good illustration, in my opinion, of the current crisis that we see in multilateralism is indeed that at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, states started negotiating masks and medical devices directly on tarmac of Chinese airports rather than referring to the mechanisms provided by multilateral institutions. As was said, one of the main reasons for questioning multilateralism is the recent disengagement from the US from several multilateral institutions and the simultaneous engagement of the People's Republic of China in the same organizations. The US under Donald Trump's presidency tends indeed to favor bilateral relations to the detriment of multilateral ones. Well, President Trump, that was also said, weakens multilateralism when he decides, for example, to leave multilateral organizations such as the World Health Organization. Simultaneously, as Mr. Sikorski said, China takes advantage of this disengagement of the US. It fills the gap, and thus it becomes a central actor of multilateralism. However, multilateralism, as it is promoted by China, leads to a world that is very different from the one that we experienced under the era of what can be called post-World War II Western multilateralism. In particular, China remains inflexible when multilateralism conflicts with matters such as democracy, individual freedom, human rights, intellectual property rights, or state capitalism. China plays by its own rules. You mentioned it, Mr. Sikorski. One may legitimately ask what the positions of the EU on the one hand and of Switzerland on the other hand should and will be under this new paradigm. Well, in order to remain a major player and to defend its democratic values and the respect of international law, the European Union may have to explicitly oppose some aspects of Chinese politics in the future. The EU will thus have to appear as a strong and independent international actor. And as was underscored before, Europe may indeed need to become a military power for that. But the EU or some of its member states may also imagine or promote new initiatives to revitalize existing multilateral organizations. It may provide them with new financial means and initiate the reforms that multilateralism clearly needs. Switzerland, on its side, has also a clear interest to support multilateralism. Our country, despite its small size, has managed to be a quite important actor of the post-World War II Western multilateralism. The principles of the multilateral legal order support indeed Switzerland's existence on the international level. Well, it is clear that an increased promotion of multilateralism by the EU or by Switzerland could benefit to the WHO, if I come back to my second theme. The organization does indeed need new funding resources after its withdrawal from the US. Any funding could, however, be made conditional to the acceptance by the organization of certain structural reforms. And here we come to the theme of the reform of multilateralism. Reforms do in fact appear necessary more than ever in a world that has been dominated by the COVID-19 pandemic for many months. The conciliant attitude of the WHO towards China, with its lack of transparency surrounding the virus, did not arouse any support for the organization. On the contrary, it demonstrated one more time the urgent need for reform. That said, the current refocus on bilateral agreements sparked by the attitude of the USA towards multilateralism should also be seen as an opportunity to start a more general reflection on the way we want international relations to be regulated in the future. Well, certainly not everything is perfect under current multilateralism. And I could go on in with this respect about the environmental issues caused by the constant increase of trade in commodities. However, in line with my argumentation, I will conclude with a question. How will states act once a vaccine against COVID-19 is discovered? And in particular, will multilateral mechanisms and institutions, such as the WHO, be able to prevent a situation whereby only the rich and powerful states have a privileged access to the vaccine? Well, I must say that I have unfortunately serious doubts about the current possibilities of action that multilateral instruments provide. And both this doubt and the meaning of this doubt show how important strong multilateralism is if one seeks for a world with less inequity and inequality. That said, I want once again to sincerely thank Mr. Radek Sikorski for having been with us today. Dziękujemy serdecznie panu Sikorskiemu za poświęcony nam dzisiaj czas i mamy nadzieję też serdecznie, że następnym razem będziemy mogli przywitać go na naszym kampusie w Lozanie. Jest bardzo ładny tutaj, troszeczkę zimno teraz, ale mamy nadzieję, że niedługo tutaj będziemy was przywitać.
Oh, very good, very good.
It was a very interesting conference and following discussion. And I definitely think that it is food for further thought. Thank you also to Mrs. Kristen Mcwelder and to the Swiss Foreign Policy Association for co-organizing this conference and for the introduction of our conference speaker and the following debate that you did. Thank you to all the staff of the Fondation Jean Monnet, of the Jean Monnet Foundation for Europe, which made sure that everything went well today, as always, when something is organized by the foundation. Thank you, finally, to the audience, which followed us on Facebook and YouTube. As I just said to Mr. Sikorski, we would have loved to welcome you here on campus, and we sincerely hope that it will be possible very soon again in the future. Have a very wonderful evening, and see you soon, hopefully, for the next events organized by the Jean Monnet Foundation for Europe, the Swiss Foreign Policy Association, and by the CEDIDAC. Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.